Welcome to An Honorable Profession, a podcast giving America hope since 2018. I'm Ryan Coonerty. Along with Debbie Cox Bultan of the New Deal, I'm lucky enough to be your co-host. An Honorable Profession is a New Deal Leaders podcast. The New Deal is an organization that supports the next generation of American leaders. From attorneys generals, to state senators, to mayors, to school board members, these are the people that are pushing policies and politics that will respond to climate change, rebuild our economy, address racial injustice, and restore our democracy. These are incredibly talented people who have dedicated themselves to public service when their country and their communities needed it the most. Check out newdealleaders.org to see what I'm talking about.
Welcome to An Honorable Profession. I'm Debbie Cox Bultan, CEO of the New Deal, where we're proud to support so many of the inspiring leaders you hear on this podcast. In this episode, I spoke with Jorge Elorza, Mayor of Providence, Rhode Island. We talked about how COVID has generated the political will to address long-standing inequities in our systems, how he hopes to remain a national leader on public safety by creating a prevention-first model, and how he's addressing racial injustice through a truth, reconciliation, and reparations process. We also talked about what makes city government so special, how his parents' sacrifice inspired him to turn his life around after high school, and how a personal tragedy redirected him from a career on Wall Street to a path of public service. Mayor Elorza, welcome to An Honorable Profession.
It's great to be here. Thank you for having me.
Of course, there's so much going on, so I really would just love to dive right in. I wanted to start by talking to you about the fact that, when we look back over the last 15 months, you and your fellow mayors have really been on the front lines of so much with the pandemic, with the resulting economic hardship so many are facing. In fact, The Hill had a piece today that said an exhausting year takes a toll on our nation's mayors. And I know for you personally, you personally were affected with COVID, by COVID, having some of your family members contract COVID. And I know that your mother spent some time in the hospital even. So I just want to start with, how is she? How are you? How is your city as you begin to open things back up?
Well, thank you for asking. My mom is doing well. This is back in March, really early on, when there was just so much confusion and so much uncertainty around it that my mother got sick. And so, we sent her to the hospital. We had to get a rescue to come pick her up. And we didn't know that we weren't going to see her for a long time. She spent a couple of weeks on a ventilator, and then rehab has been, really challenging since then. It's been over a year. But thankfully, she's still here with us. So I was navigating, trying to manage that personal situation, while at the same time, I'm trying to make sense of this pandemic and how to deal with it, how to respond to it at the city level. So it's been a really, really trying, difficult 15 months. But on the grand scheme of things, when I think back in terms of where we were and where we are now, you think back maybe 10, 11 months ago, the pandemic was at its height. The recession seemed to have no bottom. And for many of us, our streets were literally on fire. So when you think about, how things were back then to where we are right now, to be honest with you, I'm counting my blessings and feel really positive about where we are and where we're going.
Good. Well, and tell me a little bit about that in terms of where you're going. What do you feel like are some of the things that your residents most need still, families, businesses in general, as you're thinking about recovering from the recession and from getting through this public health crisis?
Well, we all know that the pandemic affected all of us, but it didn't affect all of us the same way. And, I think that it reminded us of how fragile an infrastructure we have to support our families. The way that I saw, lines around the block at soup kitchens, the way that we've seen issues of housing insecurity, homelessness, and people living in encampments, how that has continued to grow, and a myriad of different issues throughout our city. It's really reminded us how much work we have left to do there. And I'll tell you, on the policy side of things, if there's one positive that has come out of this, is that the realm of what's possible, right? This window of opportunity for what there's the political will and political appetite to take on has been blown wide open. And so things that perhaps were anathema or third rail issues just a year and a half ago. Now, more and more, they're moving to mainstream conversations. And here in Providence, we want to lead the curve. We want to make sure that we're ahead of, that we're as forward thinking as any other city in the country. So it's an exciting opportunity for us as we consider things such as a guaranteed income pilot, as we look at a comprehensive way to deal with housing insecurity, as we look at racial reparations and healing many of the racial wounds of the past, looking at deep police reform. All of those things, these are exciting opportunities to, either change existing institutions or create new institutions to replace institutions that haven't worked in the past.
Yeah, I mean, I couldn't agree with you more. And I know that working with your fellow elected officials around the country with NewDEAL, it's an opportunity and it's a responsibility. I feel like, COVID laid bare so many of these inequities that we knew existed, but, they were just, the spotlight was shown on them. And I do feel like with this, particularly with help from the federal government, with some of this American Rescue Plan dollars and hopefully infrastructure dollars, which we'll talk about, we're going to make a significant investment. So, making sure that to your point, that we're doing that in a way that builds America back better, that works for more people is really, I think, the fundamental challenge and imperative of our lifetime. So I'm happy to have you on the forefront of that in Providence. And I'd love to dive into a little bit of a couple of those issues you mentioned in greater detail. Housing, to start with, maybe this is something that, is not new to you. You've spent a bunch of your career working in the housing space. So that's why I wanted to start with it. And it's something that I hear all around the country all the time, that this lack of affordable, accessible housing is a massive challenge for people. Luckily, the eviction moratorium was extended a little bit, but it's not, we're not out of the woods by any stretch. So, and I know in March you released a 10-year anti-displacement and comprehensive housing strategy. So tell us a little bit about that. What are you hoping to accomplish over the next 10 years in Providence?
Yes. So we're looking at it from two perspectives. The first is, yes, we are seeing more and more involuntary displacement of our residents, and that's a concern. And the other side of it also is that we still have neighborhoods that have experienced decades of disinvestment. And as we build them back up, we want folks to know and to feel that they don't have to move to a different neighborhood to live in a better neighborhood. And so we're also looking at community revitalization efforts. And so, there is no magic wand. Frankly, as we've done our research, there is not a single city in the country that has cracked the code on how to prevent involuntary displacement. And so there's no just one easy solution, but it's a little bit of everything that you see. Everything that you've that we have seen. So the approach that we're taking is a comprehensive one. So we want to build more housing at every single range, and we also want to make as many units available to our existing community as possible. So that means things like looking at our zoning ordinance, allowing for greater density, but also being really smart. So we know that one of the drivers of housing unaffordability is that we have a lot of universities, colleges and universities here in our city. Now that's great, but if they're not housing their students on campus, then those students are living off campus and taking units that would otherwise be occupied by a family. And so we're looking at the role of colleges and universities. We're looking at the role of Airbnb, how many units that's taking off the market. And we're looking at, we just passed source of income as a protected class, so that people can't be discriminated against simply because they're receiving a housing voucher or other government benefits. So it really takes a comprehensive approach. And I think that for any city that wants to address the issue of housing insecurity seriously, what you need to start off by doing is to do this comprehensive report so that you can set your city on a long-term path to achieve those goals. Because it's really insightful when you step back and take this approach. You may have a pretty good sense of how your population is going to grow over the next 10 years, but do you have a really solid sense of how it is that housing opportunities are going to grow over the next 10 years? And if there's a mismatch, well, then that forces you to have a very realistic conversation about what it's going to take on the policy side to increase production so that it matches the growing demand. And so I think that this is absolutely vital for any city that's looking to tackle this. You need a comprehensive long-term plan.
Yeah. Another place where you were looking at a comprehensive plan was even before the pandemic was infrastructure. I know that you were talking a lot about that being your top priority and trying to make a real transformational investment in Providence. Fast forward 15 months, now we're talking about that at the national level. There may be some significant federal dollars coming to cities, hopefully, to help with some of that. Where do you see the greatest need in Providence for those kinds of investments in infrastructure?
Yeah. Well, I want to begin by saying I can't miss the opportunity to say that, boy, does it feel good that the federal government is actually doing stuff again.
Yeah, please say that.
I've been mayor. I've been mayor now for 6.5 years, and for the past 4 years, it's felt as though not just opposition, but an opponent in the federal government, and to know that you actually have a partner in governing in our federal government is great. With that said, as much as I'm enthusiastic about the new administration's energetic agenda, I will tell you that not here in Providence and nowhere in the country are mayors holding their breath and waiting for Washington to come to our rescue. So we're hoping that there's an infrastructure bill and we're weighing in so that we can shape it. But at the same time, we have our priorities and we have our needs that we're moving forward on. So over the past several years, while there's been talk of billion, 10 billion, 100 trillion dollar infrastructure package in Washington, it's been all talk. But at the city level and at the local level, through local bond measures, there's been approvals of hundreds of billions of dollars of this work. So at the local level, mayors have kept the investments in infrastructure going. As I look throughout our city, there are two main areas where these infrastructure needs are prioritized. The first is in our school buildings. Unfortunately, as a city, we have disinvested from so many of our school buildings, and even just getting our buildings to where they're warm, safe, and dry is going to take investments beyond our capacity at this time. So that's certainly one area where we hope there's more investment from the federal government. The other area I think is one that's really interesting to policymakers, to city builders, and for folks who care a great deal about urbanism. So, as we're building our roads, we're not building our roads in the same way that they were built 30, 40, 50 years ago. As we're building our roads today, we're integrating the latest principles of sustainability. How do we make sure that we limit stormwater runoff? How do we make sure that we have very sustainable products and other features that are added to our street design plans? We're also very interested in slowing down traffic and, in effect, building our cities for people and not for cars. It's a push that we're making here in Providence, where we want folks to leave the car at home, either hop on their bicycle, on a scooter, on a bike share program, or just walk to work. So that's integrating our infrastructure plans with our zoning ordinances that encourage greater livability, more vibrancy, more foot traffic. So, at the same time that we're rebuilding our roads, we want to make sure they have all of these features to be much more in line with the kind of urban living that people are demanding today. And so as long as we have that flexibility from the federal government, and it's not prescriptive in terms of how or where it can be used, folks at the local level are going to make the best decisions for their communities, including setting our cities and our metro areas up as leading international cities for the next generation. So it's extremely exciting, and I hope that not only the federal package passes, I hope it gives us the flexibility, but even if it doesn't, we're prepared to do this work regardless.
I love that. And you're putting your money where your mouth is. I know you're an avid biker. I think that you ride your bike to work most days, right? So you're living your vision. I want to turn to something else that when we're talking about and you mentioned this earlier, but when we're thinking about the events over the last year, obviously another one that's been front and center is the renewed conversation around race in America, sparked by the murder of George Floyd and then the protests. One response that you've led in Providence is to reexamine the way that public safety and justice is delivered, particularly in communities of color. And in April this year, you announced a comprehensive review of that budget and those practices. And it looks like you're thinking about shifting to a prevention first model in Providence. So what does that mean? How did that review go? And what kind of reforms are you going to be championing going forward?
Right. So Providence has been a leader in public safety for a long time. And, beginning about 20 years ago, the city went all in on community policing. And so it was a fairly new concept at the time. And, it was poo-pooed, it was sometimes outrightly dismissed, but oftentimes it was resisted by the community. But nonetheless, city leaders, including leadership in the police department, they were all in. And over the past 20 years, look at what we've seen. We've seen record declines in violent crime, property crime, crime across the board. And in fact, we've been able to do this even with fewer police officers than there were back in the 1990s. And so, there's something smart about community policing. And just as Providence was a leader 20 years ago, we're positioning ourselves so that we're going to be leaders for the next 20 years as well. And what that means is diving into a prevention first model. And when I think about what's possible with crime, I think that the best analogy is look at the amazing success that we've had with fire prevention. Look, a long time ago, there were massive fires on a pretty regular basis. Cities throughout the country, they moved to a prevention first model. So this is where you start seeing fire prevention systems. You see sprinklers, you see alarms, you see housing codes and building codes that help mitigate some of the dangers that property owners, homeowners experience. And look at where we are today. The report that we just released showed that less than 2% of all calls that come into the fire department are for actual fires. And so, we've gone from a department that, has been perhaps the best in the world at putting out fires to one that very rarely has to put out a fire. And they've transitioned to, where they do a lot more of EMS and rescue work. Well, that's an amazing success for the fire department. And we think we can do something very similar when it comes to crime. However, we can't continue to put everything on the shoulders of the police department, right? The police department, they have their role, they have their specific training, and they are good at certain things. But over the while, we've put more and more on their shoulders simply because we've had no one else to send to them. Take, for example, mental health crises. If someone's having a suicidal episode or some kind of mental health crisis, we send a police officer because we have no one else to send. And, God bless them, police officers show up on the scene and, they do, the best that they can, but they're not trained professionals at this. And what we want to do is we want to provide those trained professionals so that when you call 911, the answer on the other line will be, is this police, fire, or mental health? And there are options available. This is going to help us do two things. It's going to help us first provide better services to the community in need. And second, it's going to help us, frankly, free up police officer time so that they can dedicate, the most valuable resource they have, their time, to the issues that only they can address, and building relationships into the community so that in the community so that there's more trust between them and our police department. So, I think that there are smart and intelligent things that we can do. We're taking a comprehensive approach to this so that we can continue to be leaders at a national level in terms of police reform and the way that we respond and serve our community.
Yeah, and just to follow up on that, do you feel like there's widespread support for this? I think it's such a smart strategy, and I know that other cities are looking at other ways to try to get the right people responding to the right situations, as you're saying. Is that a popular, are people on board with that, or do you see that this is going to take some explaining to people to get people on board?
To be honest with you, my experience has been is that there's a lot of support for this, and it's an idea that kind of sells itself. So you look at both sides of this. You look at both sides of the debate. If it's presented as these are real challenges that police officers aren't equipped to address, then it just makes sense to bring professionals in to address them. We've seen a marked increase in the calls for service for mental health crises. And, this is an increase over services that we weren't able to fully provide in the past. So we're just seeing more and more of a need, and I think it sells itself. On the flip side of it, also, this idea that it frees police officers up so that they can do more of the work that only they can do. Well, that's also something that's intuitively very appealing and just makes sense to folks. And so, we're looking at, these mental health episodes that perhaps we could take off of police officers' shoulders. We're also looking at fender bender traffic accidents where no one is injured. Do we really need someone with a badge and a gun to go and fill out a report? Frankly, a report that serves the benefit of perhaps no one beyond private insurance companies. This is like a subsidy that we're providing for them. But I think private industry is also pretty good at filling in voids and blanks when they need to. I'm sure there's a solution they can come up with. Is this the best use of our time on the police side? These are all questions that we're asking. And, the more and more that I dive into it, the more I see that it just makes sense to make these changes. Again, not only will it provide more time for officers to do the work that only they can do, but we're also going to provide better services to the community, which is ultimately what this is all about.
Yeah, I love that. And I haven't heard anyone make the analogy with the fire department before. So I think that I appreciate that I think people can get their head around that, right? That they know how departments have evolved. So I think that's really fantastic. This is one response to what happened this year with George Floyd and police reform. But you've been addressing systemic racism and thinking about ways to lift up members of your community for a long time. You led in 2016 a One Providence initiative in response to some rising hate crimes at that time. And more recently, in 2020, you've launched a Truth and Reconciliation and Reparations process, as well as created an African-American ambassador group to amplify the voices of Black members of your community to engage more diverse voices in the policymaking process. So how are some of those issues and efforts going? And in particular, I think it's really interesting. I don't know if our listeners are aware that there are a number of cities who are looking at the reparations issue in particular at the city level, and you're on the forefront of the folks doing that. So how is that going? Kind of what is the thinking and the process behind how you're going to approach that?
Well, it's ongoing work, and it's really exciting work. I start with the understanding that as a country, we've never addressed the racial issue head on. Going back to the Constitutional Convention, right? It was the dividing issue. There was a compromise that kind of worked, mostly didn't work. And so we just lived to fight another day. It came up again in 1820 with the Missouri Compromise, came up 35 years later, the Nebraska-Kansas Act. It divided the country, but we have never fully addressed it head on. And look at where it's gotten us. And so, the wounds around racial injustice, they run deep. And if we want to address it, well, then we have to go to the source. We have to address it at a systemic level. And that's what led me, along with the African American Ambassador Group, to jump into and wade into this topic. So we launched our own Truth, Reconciliation, and Reparations process. So it's a 3-phase process. Each phase is just as important as the other. But it starts off with just recording and documenting some fundamental truths about our community, making sure that this unfortunate legacy of racial injustice and discrimination, that it be more widely known. These aren't sort of abstract things that happened somewhere else. They happened right here in our community. And they had impact on families of people that still live in our community, people that we know. So through this truth process, we engaged a group of researchers, and they produced a 200-page book called A Matter of Truth, where they documented our history in a number of different areas. And so, we want this to become fingertip knowledge for our community. We want this to be integrated into the curriculum in our schools. And we just want people to know the truth. This is then going to lead to our reconciliation process. I truly believe that every single human being, we have a moral instinct inside of us. And whenever we're confronted with some form of patent injustice, that instinct is triggered, and we want to be part of the solution. We want to engage, and we want to help fix what's wrong. And so we are not the first city in the country. We're not the first place in the world that will go through a reconciliation process. But the idea is to engage as much of the community and as much of the public together to make sure that, there is broad political will to continue this racial justice work long after I'm gone as mayor and, long after, the current group of city leaders has transitioned to the next generation. And then from this reconciliation phase, we're launching the reparations phase. And this is part of just doing what's right. As a city, we can't correct for all of the wrongs of the past, but that doesn't mean that we shouldn't try and we shouldn't wade into this space. So we will be forming a reparations committee, and they'll be making recommendations to me on what form and shape reparations should take. And then it's on me, city leaders, and whoever comes next to make good on that. And so that's a commitment that we're making. But more than that, by coordinating with mayors throughout the country, we want to do more than just move our communities forward. We know that we can't make right all the wrongs of the past. But if we can inspire and encourage other levels of government and other institutions in our community to also jump in and have this and make this reparations conversation a mainstream everyday conversation, well, then at that level, we can begin to more fully address some of the injustices of the past. So again, it's about taking a comprehensive approach. It requires a lot of time and a dedication of a great deal of resources. But on the whole, we're living in a moment right now where it seems as though the forces that are pulling us apart are as strong as they have ever been. And so how do we be that force that pulls people together? And we see this as an important way to bring our community together.
I love that. I love that. Before I move on to asking you a little bit about your own life and journey into this public service and elected office, as I was listening to you today, and also as I was preparing for this conversation with you, I've really heard a lot of themes in the way you talk about the way you approach being mayor. And I wonder, I'm going to name a few and see if this resonates with you, and see if I'm getting these right, and see if there's others that you might add. I mean, it feels like, really thinking holistically about problems is a big kind of framework way that you think about things, as well as using data and evidence to make decisions. This kind of, starting with the truth piece is what you were just talking about, and just getting that information first before you're making decisions, as well as, and we didn't talk about this, but you also, I know, have put a strong emphasis on customer service. That came through some of your answers, but I know that was something you started with when you became mayor back in 2015 originally. So those are some of the themes I've kind of heard from you about approaching the job of being mayor. Do those sound right to you? And what else do you think about in terms of the framework in which you govern?
So yes, those all definitely seem right. If I may, I'll also say that, this is something that's not unique to Providence. And, there's a phenomenon that's been happening for maybe 10, 20 years in America, where city halls, they're not led by the party boss kind of mayor, right? It's not the political machine that decides who gets into City Hall, who doesn't. That's a thing of the past. Really today, mayors, we're city executives. We see ourselves as executives. It's how we do our job, how we approach everything that we do. And I'll go a step further and say that, if you look at the elected official landscape throughout the country, city halls are the best run level of government anywhere in our country right now. It's certainly not Washington. And even at the state level, you get into this ideological back and forth. But there's something about leadership at the mayoral level that just forces you to be practical, solutions-oriented, data-driven. We're held accountable by our constituents every single day, right? They see me in the supermarket and they hold me accountable. We often say that there are three main political parties in the United States. There are Republicans, there are Democrats, and there are mayors. And mayors are just focused on getting stuff done. And we still work together in a bipartisan way, in a way that bipartisanship almost doesn't exist anymore at other levels of government. You do see it here. And so this idea of thinking holistically and bringing a problem-solving lens to what we do, being driven by data, and serving our constituents, absolutely, those are all things that we live by here in Providence. But I'll tell you that, it's not just Providence, it's the way that mayors operate.
Yeah, I love that. And for the record, I love mayors for exactly that reason. They're problem solvers and they get stuff done. So let's talk about how you became CEO of your city and so to start with, I'm curious. So your parents immigrated from Guatemala. Why Providence? What brought them to America, and why Providence in particular?
So the American dream brought them to America, and what brought them to Providence was jobs. So, my parents' story is it's the classic, yet improbable immigrant story. So they came to Providence, they worked in the factories, there were good paying jobs for people who didn't have a formal education. So, my mother worked second shift her entire life. To date, even today as we speak, she's probably leaving for work sometime very, very soon. My father worked in the factory. We're big in the jewelry trade here in Providence, and my dad dedicated his life to that. And, they lived in a world, and they came to this city at a time when it provided opportunities for people from throughout the world. And not only here in Providence, but I'm really concerned about, those opportunities disappearing. There are people that are working really hard, doing a gig economy job, a side hustle here, maybe working full-time somewhere else, and they're still falling behind. That's not who we are. That strikes at the core of what this American dream is all about. You shouldn't be working around the clock and still falling behind. I've heard it said provocatively, and also sadly, that if you're looking for the American dream nowadays, you're better off going to Canada. That can't be who we are. That can't be what we're about. So much of what motivates me is, seeing myself and young people throughout the city, and seeing my parents' experience in so much of what I see happening out there. We're filled with people who are chasing that American dream, just want what's best for them and their kids. And I want to provide those opportunities so that they can, perhaps one day their son is mayor and they can feel just as proud of him as my parents are of me.
I love that. Well, and you had an interesting journey to be mayor, because as I've heard you say, you weren't particularly a great student. That wasn't your thing when you were younger, but eventually you graduated top of your class from the university in accounting, and then obviously you went to work on Wall Street for a while there. So what turned things around in those parts of your life there?
So again, it's deeply personal. There were two moments in my life that really stand out. The first is my high school graduation. So I was a dunce in high school. Yeah, I started veering off in the wrong direction. And I found out I was graduating just a couple of days before graduation day. So I did graduate, but I had gotten rejected from every college and university that I applied to. So here I am. All of my friends are celebrating. They're going off to college, and their best days are ahead of them. Whereas I'm sitting there trying to figure out, am I going to work in the same factory as my dad, or am I going to get my act together? And on top of that, I'm thinking to myself, my parents had sacrificed so much so that I could be there, and I'm squandering these opportunities. And I resolved to myself at a very, in a very sort of deeply personal way, that I would do everything I could so that all my parents' efforts would not be in vain, and so that I could show the world and myself what I was capable of. So I started off at community college. For the first time in my life, I worked hard. I did well. Then I got accepted into the state university, this program that got inner city kids into college. So again, worked hard, did well, graduated first in my class as an accountant. And then I went off to New York. I thought I was going to live, the fast-paced life in Manhattan and make a lot of money and live that kind of success. But then I got a call one night from my father. In the middle of the night, the phone rang, and he told me that one of my best friends from my old neighborhood had just been murdered. So my friend Jose is someone I had always looked up to, and I just cried for Jose. And that night I resolved that I was going to come back to Providence. I didn't know what I was going to do, but I know I wanted to serve my community, and that's what set me down this path of being a public servant and being committed to public interest. And so, I've been an attorney, I've been a law professor, I've been a judge, and now I'm mayor. I don't see any of those as a change in career. I just see that as different shapes that my public service has taken. And, regardless of where I go from here, I know that I'm still going to continue to do this work in the community. It'll simply take different shapes into the future.
Yeah, I'm so sorry for your loss. And it is an amazing story. You have done so much good work in all the stripes of the ways you've said in terms of your nonprofit and teaching, your so many different areas. I do want to ask you, what was it that prompted you to run for office? That was a different direction, a step. What made you wake up and decide, I'm going to do this. I'm going to run for mayor?
Yeah, well, it took a lot, to be honest with you, because I grew up in Providence. And if you're my age, you grew up in Providence in the 90s, politics probably lives a distaste in your mouth. So we had a mayor, this larger than life figure named Buddy Cianci, who was corrupt. He was a criminal in every way. He served 2 separate stretches. Both of them ended with him resigning and going off to jail. And so growing up, I thought that, politics was dirty. Politicians were corrupt, and I wanted nothing to do with it. And it was like that, long into adulthood. But then what happened for me was that I became a housing court judge. And through the housing court, this is in the midst of the foreclosure crisis, I brought in the biggest banks in the world, and I held them accountable for the abandoned properties that were, riddled throughout the city and had just been wasting away for years. And I saw the impact that you can have, the change that you can make in a community in these public roles. And I've always been very interested. I've always been passionate about making a difference in the community. And that's what first got me thinking, if I can have this much of an impact through the courts, wow, imagine the kind of impact I can have in the mayor's office. And so it's that spirit of wanting to make a difference that said, I'm willing to put up with some of the silliness of politics. And I got elected, and I tell you, it's been an absolute privilege to serve for the last 6.5 years. And it's just an experience that I've enjoyed through and through, every moment of the day.
So wonderful. And you are in your second term, as you mentioned. Any thoughts about what comes next for you?
So I'm term limited. And so if I could, I would run for mayor one more term. I think that 12 years would be just about right. But unfortunately, I can't. But I do think I have one more race in me. So, I can't run here at the city level, but, we're looking to move up. We'll be making an announcement on that in the next couple of months or so.
That sounds great. Well, Mayor Elorza, it was really wonderful to talk to you. And thank you so much for all the work that you've done in Providence. And at this really critical time for our country, as we've talked about. This is a once in a generation, once in a lifetime opportunity. And the strides you're making for your folks, and will continue to make it, whatever you choose to do next, are greatly appreciated. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Debbie. It's been a pleasure being with you.
Thanks for listening to An Honorable Profession. Please subscribe to hear more amazing leaders. And keep asking your elected officials to be honorable. Boots Road Group produces podcast. I'm Ryan Coonerty, and because we keep things honorable, no tax dollars were used in the making of this podcast.